Chapter 1: A Promising Dawn. The sun had only just begun its slow climb above the distant mountains, casting a golden hue over the vast expanse of the ranch. A wide, endless sky stretched out, its soft light illuminating the rugged land below. The morning air was still cool, crisp with the promise of a new day, but it held a dryness that spoke of the land's struggles. The horizon, thick with low-hanging mist, made the earth seem endless, as if it stretched into the very heart of the world. Will Parker sat tall in the saddle, the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves echoing in the quiet of the morning. His horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Buck, picked its way carefully over the rocky terrain, the reins resting loosely in Will's gloved hand. Will's eyes swept over the land, the same land he had worked since he was a boy. The wide, sprawling ranch looked peaceful enough from a distance, but he knew better than most that appearances were deceiving. His gaze lingered on the weathered barn in the distance. The wood was faded from years of sun, its structure sagging under the weight of time. The roof, patched and patched again, was barely holding together. It was the kind of place that spoke to years of hard labor and the constant strain of maintaining something that was slowly falling apart. Still, it was home. The cattle grazed lazily on the hillsides, their thick coats a patchwork of browns and blacks against the dry grass. The air was thick with the scent of the earth dirt, hay, and the faint odor of the herd. The sound of cattle lowing in the distance added a comforting sense of life to the silence. Will breathed in deeply, feeling the dust in the air settle into his lungs. This was the frontier, the harsh, unforgiving beauty of it. Buck's hooves crunched against the gravel road that ran along the farthest fence line. Will's eyes narrowed as he inspected the posts, the sagging wires in need of repair. Another core to add to the list. It was always something. The ranch had never been easy, but it was all he had. His family's land, passed down from father to son, was his legacy. He knew the land better than he knew himself. Each twist and turn of the fences, each hill, each stream, he could have walked it blindfolded and still found his way. But lately, something had been off. The cattle were thinner than usual. The water had become scarcer, the drought wearing the earth down a little more every day. Will's hands tightened on the reins, his fingers flexing in irritation. It was a deep, gnawing worry that had taken root in him in recent months, one that he couldn't quite shake. As the horse moved forward, Will's thoughts drifted to his father's words, the man who had taught him everything he knew about the land. A ranch can be a cruel mistress, his father had said more than once, but she'll repay your labor if you're patient. Will had always believed that, had always thought that he could weather whatever storms came his way. But the drought wasn't the only threat. Not anymore. He looked out at the distant hills, the soft glow of the morning light revealing the faded, crumbling outline of a rival ranch. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how many hours he put in, that land seemed to edge ever closer, creeping onto his territory, tightening its hold. The wind shifted, kicking up a small swirl of dust around his boots. Will's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as the wind stung his face. His gaze returned to the worn fence posts and the tired barn, the endless expanse of land he was struggling to hold on to. The work was endless, but it had to be done. There was no other choice. His thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of a bell, distant and soft but familiar. One of the cowhands was calling the herd in for morning roundup. Will shifted in the saddle, his muscles already beginning to ache from the day's work that awaited him. His chest tightened slightly, a subtle knot in his gut. It was more than just the ranch he was concerned about. He felt the weight of his father's expectations, the pressure of the land he was entrusted with, and the looming uncertainty of what was coming next. The dry wind tousled his dark hair, and Will pushed forward, heading toward the herd. The day had only just begun, and already it felt like there were not enough hours to get everything done. But that was the life of a rancher: constant work, constant worry. Still, he had never known anything else. It was in his blood. He would keep going, even when the land seemed to fight against him. Because that was what men like him did. They kept going. The midday sun blazed overhead, casting a shimmering haze across the dry landscape. Will Parker had been on his feet since dawn, tending to cattle, mending fences, and overseeing the day's work. His shirt clung to his back, heavy with sweat, and his hat offered little relief from the punishing heat. The endless stretch of land seemed to hold the heat in, pressing down on him like an iron weight. A soft breeze stirred the dry grasses, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and earth. It wasn't much, but it was enough to bring him a brief moment of relief as he led his horse toward the weathered water trough. The trough, chipped and cracked from years of use, stood like a sentinel in the middle of the parched earth. Will leaned over the side and filled his canteen, the sound of the water splashing against the metal a small but comforting reminder of the work that had yet to be done. His hands were rough from years of hard labor, calloused and weathered, much like the land he worked. He unscrewed the cap and took a long drink, the cool liquid refreshing against the dry heat of his mouth. As he tipped the canteen back into its leather pouch, a voice carried to him from the shade of a nearby cottonwood tree. "Will, you hear about the disappearances?" He looked up, his gaze falling on Jeb, one of the older cowhands who had been with the ranch for years. His weathered face was creased with worry as he lowered his voice, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "Cattle gone missing. Out of the east pasture. Whole damn herd disappeared without a trace." Jeb shook his head in disbelief. "And it ain't the first time. There's talk of rustlers ones we ain't seen before." Will's gut tightened at the mention of rustlers. It wasn't the first time such rumors had reached his ears, but the frequency of them was starting to weigh on him. He had heard whispers of cattle disappearing under the cover of darkness, cattle that had simply vanished as if they'd been swallowed whole by the night. And now, here was Jeb, confirming what had been drifting in the air like smoke. "They're moving in closer," Jeb continued, his voice low and urgent, "taking what ain't theirs while we're stretched thin. We can't keep letting them do it. Something's gotta give." Will's heart sank. He had seen signs of trouble before: tracks, a rustled campfire, horses that didn't belong, but this felt different. It wasn't just a handful of stolen cattle, it was something more. There was a method to it now. A purpose. "Where's the sheriff?" Will asked, his voice tight. He hadn't been one to rely on lawmen out here in the frontier. It was more about self-preservation than justice, but if things were escalating, he'd have to consider other options. Jeb's lips thinned, his eyes narrowed. He's been busy with his own problems. You know how it is. "Seems like we're on our own out here." Will nodded, though he wasn't sure if he was reassured or even more troubled. As Jeb ambled back toward the barn, Will's thoughts turned inward. He couldn't afford to lose any more cattle, not with the drought taking its toll on the ranch. If these rustlers kept up their thieving, it wouldn't be long before the ranch was in serious jeopardy. A distant sound broke his reverie, the faintest rustle in the air, followed by a cloud of dust rising in the far distance, near the eastern boundary of the ranch. Will's gaze shifted toward it, his jaw tightening. The dust rose like a storm, a thick cloud swirling in the wind. It wasn't the kind of storm that would bring rain. This was the kind of dust storm that preceded trouble. Something was on the move out there, something he needed to investigate, but not yet. Not yet. He turned back toward the ranch house, his thoughts already racing through his mind. There was no denying it now, his worst fears were starting to materialize. He made his way up to the porch of the house, his boots crunching on the dry ground, and found a letter waiting for him on the doorstep. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, and his stomach tightened as he reached for it. He tore it open quickly, scanning the few lines of ink that had been hastily scribbled across the page. The words blurred in front of him for a moment as he processed them. His debts mounting faster than he could pay were the least of his worries. The letter was from a creditor, but the real weight of it came from a much more ominous threat. A rival rancher was encroaching on his land. The letter spoke of a man named Brock McLean, a man who had begun buying up land just to the north of his. McLean wasn't the type to take no for an answer. His reputation as a ruthless businessman and a hard hand in a fight preceded him. Will's fingers tightened around the paper, his thoughts racing. If McLean was making a move on his land, then everything he had worked for, everything his father had built, was in jeopardy. The ranch wasn't just his livelihood, it was his legacy. The ranch's name gnawed at the edges of his mind. McLean was a man who knew how to play the game, a man who didn't hesitate to take what he wanted. Will had heard the rumors of McLean's aggressive expansion plans and his willingness to push others out of the way. He'd seen his kind before, land-hungry, merciless, and willing to do whatever it took to get what they wanted. Will crumpled the letter in his fist, staring down at the worn wooden steps beneath him, the weight of his situation pressing on him like the heat of the midday sun. His pride, his determination, and his stubborn refusal to accept defeat, they all screamed at him to hold on, to fight for what was his. But a deeper part of him, the part that had learned the harsh lessons of the frontier, wondered if he was already too late. If the storm of trouble was already on him, and the land he loved so much would slip through his fingers like sand. His mind raced with 100 thoughts: how to pay off the debts, how to stop the rustlers, how to hold off McLean, but one thought remained: there was no easy way out. The road ahead was going to be hard, and the stakes had never been higher. He took a long breath, feeling the weight of it all settle in his chest. The ranch was in danger, and so was his pride, his future, his very way of life. Yet he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let it go without a fight. Not without a damn good fight. The wind stirred again, kicking up more dust, and Will turned, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The storm wasn't just coming, it was already here. And it was time to face it head on. The Montgomery estate stood in stately silence, a testament to both grandeur and loss. From its manicured gardens, lush with fragrant roses and climbing ivy, to the imposing columns that flanked its entrance, the mansion was a place of quiet beauty, crafted with care and purpose. The long windows, framed with thick velvet drapes, reflected the soft golden light of the afternoon sun. Inside, all was still, as if the house itself held its breath, waiting for something, perhaps for life to return, perhaps for the echo of a past that had once filled its halls with laughter and warmth. Charlotte Montgomery moved through the corridors of the house, her footsteps soft on the polished wooden floors, a faint click of her heels reverberating as she passed the ornate paintings that adorned the walls. Each portrait, carefully hung in its gilded frame, depicted someone who had once been important to her late husband, her parents, their friends and associates. Their painted smiles seemed to mock her as she walked by, reminding her of the life she had lost and the role she was now left to play. The scent of lavender from the garden wafted through the open window, mingling with the faint smell of dust that had started to settle on the furniture. Charlotte paused by the grand staircase, her gaze lifting to the portrait of her husband, Nathaniel Montgomery. His face, so familiar to her, was set in an expression of polite indifference, as it had often been in life. His brown eyes, so like her own, seemed to follow her every movement, and for a moment she felt an inexplicable tightness in her chest. She exhaled softly, pushing the ache of grief aside as she turned away from the portrait. Life had gone on after Nathaniel's death, and so had she, though the life she lived now was vastly different from the one she had once imagined. She had loved him once, or perhaps she had simply loved the idea of the life he promised her: comfort, status and respect. Now, his absence left a void, a silence in the house that no amount of flowers or fine china could fill. Charlotte walked toward her bedroom, her fingers lightly brushing the lace curtains that framed the large windows overlooking the gardens. She had dressed carefully this morning, choosing a high-collared gown of deep blue silk that matched the shade of the sky outside. The fabric clung to her slender frame, and the soft ruffles at the hem made a delicate sound as she moved. Her hair, dark and lustrous, was pinned up in a series of intricate curls that hinted at the elegance she had once been known for in society. She sat before the vanity, the polished mirror reflecting her image in soft, muted tones. Her hands moved automatically, brushing her hair back with practiced ease, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She had once taken comfort in the rituals of dressing, an act of control, a way to keep the world at arm's length. But today her fingers faltered. She reached for the delicate lace handkerchief her husband had once gifted her, its edges frayed from years of use, and ran it between her fingers. The letter she had received that morning rested on the vanity, unopened. It was from one of her closest friends in society, a woman she had shared countless teas and sorrows with. The letter contained the usual pleasantries, but Charlotte knew it also carried something else: an invitation. The invitation to another high society gathering, one that would be held at the home of a newlywed couple in town. Charlotte's fingers hovered over the letter for a moment, a quiet war brewing inside her. In another time she would have accepted without hesitation, eager to return to the world she had once inhabited. But now she hesitated. What purpose did she serve there? The circles she once moved in seemed like a world apart, a realm of frivolous chatter and genteel competition that no longer held any meaning for her. She had been a wife, a part of that world, but now she was a widow alone. Her status in society had not changed, but her place in it felt fragile, like an illusion that could shatter at any moment. Charlotte reached for the letter and tore it open with a practiced, if slightly detached, motion. She read the words, but they held no true weight for her. She could see the fine handwriting, the careful flourishes that marked the letter's sender as a woman of high station. Still, it felt distant, almost unreal. She had long since grown weary of the polished society, the endless performances of wealth and respectability. She had hoped that, in her solitude, she might find something else, something more meaningful. But it seemed that the life she had once known still called to her, a reminder of what she had lost. She could hear the faint sounds of conversation in the hallway, servants moving about, preparing for dinner. The house was never truly empty, yet the silence in her heart remained, unbroken. Charlotte sighed, setting the letter down beside her. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, the woman who stared back at her, a stranger, even though she knew the lines of her face as well as she knew her own soul. A soft pang of loneliness swept over her. She had long ago learned to mask it, to play the role expected of her, but it was there, beneath the surface, a longing for something more than the endless routines of high society, a yearning for purpose beyond her carefully constructed life. She stood, smoothing the folds of her gown, and glanced once more at the portrait of Nathaniel. His cold, indifferent gaze met hers once again, and for a fleeting moment, Charlotte allowed herself to mourn the life that could have been. But she quickly squashed the feeling. There was no place for such weakness here. She was a Montgomery, and the world would continue to expect her to play her part, to uphold the legacy of her late husband. But what if there was more for her? What if there was something beyond the walls of this estate, beyond the confines of a life defined by grief and duty? The thought lingered in her mind like a whisper, one she could neither fully embrace nor dismiss. The weight of her solitude settled over her once again as she moved toward the window, gazing out at the garden below. The flowers in full bloom seemed to mock her. They thrived in the warmth of the sun, while she remained a prisoner to the shadows of her past. A faint wind stirred the branches of the trees outside, and Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment, letting the breeze touch her face. There was something calling to her, something beyond this gilded cage. And though she could not yet name it, she knew one thing for certain: the life she had known, the life she had been resigned to, was no longer enough. There was a longing in her heart that refused to be ignored, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to finally listen. The town square was a whirlwind of activity, despite the heat of a summer afternoon. The local church hall, modest but dignified in its whitewashed simplicity, had been transformed for the occasion. Wreaths of wild flowers hung from the walls, and the tables were laden with plates of sweet pastries, pies, and chilled lemonade, a welcome reprieve from the oppressive warmth of the day. The scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the subtle floral notes from the garden, and the air hummed with the low murmur of conversation. Charlotte Montgomery moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her steps graceful and measured as she made her way from one group to another. Her presence was both commanding and serene, the deep blue silk gown she wore catching the light just so, its intricate lace at the cuffs and neckline lending an air of quiet sophistication. Her hair was swept up into an elegant knot at the back of her neck, soft curls framing her face like the petals of a flower. Despite her composed appearance, Charlotte felt a twinge of discomfort as she greeted the familiar faces in the crowd, women dressed in bright, cheerful dresses that seemed to shimmer with life, men laughing easily over cigars and glasses of whiskey. There was no denying that the gathering she had once enjoyed, filled with lively chatter and gossip, no longer held the same appeal. She no longer felt like a part of this world. She was a widow, an outsider, and though no one dared voice it, the sympathy in their eyes was like a weight on her shoulders. As she made her way to the far corner of the room, near the refreshment table, Charlotte overheard a conversation between two women, their voices pitched low but unmistakably loud in the quiet hum of the gathering. "Such a shame, isn't it?" one woman whispered, her eyes flicking toward Charlotte. "To lose one's husband so young, and now she's left to fend for herself. I heard she's doing well with her estate," the other replied, her tone almost too eager to offer consolation. "But of course there's only so much one can do. A woman on her own, it's not proper, really." Charlotte's smile was tight as she poured herself a glass of lemonade, the clinking of the glass against the table serving as a quiet reminder of the conversations that seemed to swirl around her at every gathering. She had once been at the center of these events, her name spoken with admiration and respect. But now she felt like a shadow in a world that no longer had a place for her. She turned her attention away from the murmurs, scanning the room with a practiced calm. Her gaze swept over the familiar faces of town folk, some warm with genuine affection, others, like the two women, with pity veiled in polite smiles. But then something caught her eye. Across the room, near the doorway, stood a man who didn't belong. His posture was too casual, too unrefined for the setting, and his presence too solid, too grounded to blend in with the rest of the guests. He was tall, his broad shoulders filling the space he occupied, and his face weathered, but strong spoke of years spent under the sun. His dark hair was tousled, a stark contrast to the neatly groomed men of the town. He was dressed simply, in a worn coat and trousers that had seen better days, but there was something about him, something in the way he carried himself, that drew her in. For a moment their eyes met. Charlotte felt a strange flicker of recognition, but it was not the kind of recognition she was accustomed to. This man did not see her as a widow to be pitied or as a woman of society to be admired. Instead, he saw her as someone real, someone who, perhaps, understood the weight of the world. His gaze was steady, a hint of curiosity in his dark eyes, and she saw no judgment there, only a quiet understanding. Her breath hitched ever so slightly, and her pulse quickened, though she quickly masked it with the careful poise she had mastered over the years. The man did not approach her, not yet. He remained standing at the edge of the room, his arms crossed loosely over his chest, observing the proceedings with a certain detachment. It was as if he were an outsider himself, like a man who had never belonged to such refined society. And yet, there was something undeniably magnetic about him, something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't until later, when the conversation shifted to another group, that Charlotte found herself walking toward the door, drawn by a force she couldn't resist. Her curiosity propelled her, and when she looked back, she saw that the man had moved closer, as if in quiet acknowledgement of their shared moment. Their eyes met again. The air between them seemed to hum with something unspoken as Charlotte came to stand before him, her heart beating just a little faster than it had moments before. "Good afternoon, Miss Montgomery," the man said in a deep, gravelly voice that was both respectful and distant. "I trust you're enjoying the event." His words were polite, but there was an edge to his tone that suggested he was not one for small talk. Charlotte studied him, her gaze lingering on the lines of his face, the way the sun had etched itself into his skin, the faint scar that traced his jaw. His eyes, dark and thoughtful, didn't flinch under her scrutiny. He was not intimidated by her, and that alone made her keenly aware of the gulf that existed between them. "I'm finding it tolerable," Charlotte replied with a soft smile, her voice steady, though the conversation felt like a thread pulling her in a direction she wasn't sure she wanted to follow. "Indeed," he said, his gaze shifting to the crowd as if the forced pleasantries were not of interest to him. "I've heard much about the town and the people who live here, though I admit I never imagined I'd be attending such an event." His comment, though casual, carried an air of candidness that she found both refreshing and unsettling. He was not trying to impress her with empty pleasantries. Instead, he was simply stating the truth. He wasn't here for the celebration, but for something else, something that was just as real and just as unspoken between them. "I gather you don't frequent these types of gatherings," Charlotte said, the curiosity she had felt earlier now blooming into a more direct question. He met her gaze again, his lips curving slightly, as if amused. "You could say I'm more accustomed to the frontier than the parlor." She couldn't help the soft laugh that escaped her lips, surprised by how his words struck a chord deep within her. He was a man who didn't belong in a room full of well-to-do people, and yet she felt an unspoken connection that transcended their differences. "I imagine the frontier is quite different from here," Charlotte said, her voice quieter now, as if the weight of their exchange had grown heavier. "The land doesn't care much for social graces," he replied, his tone more serious now, his eyes lingering on hers. "But it has its own way of demanding respect." A silence fell between them, thick with meaning. Charlotte knew that beneath his words lay something more, something she could not yet fully grasp but felt stirring in the depths of her own heart. There was hardship in his voice, a quiet strength that echoed her own unspoken struggles. She smiled softly, the first real smile she'd offered all afternoon. "It sounds like you understand the weight of the land, much like I understand the weight of other things." He gave a brief, knowing nod. "I suppose we all have our burdens," and in that moment Charlotte realized that their conversation, brief though it was, had planted a seed between them. A quiet understanding, born not from pleasantries or pity, but from shared experience. Perhaps there was something to this stranger, something she hadn't expected to find in a man like him. And perhaps, just perhaps, their paths had crossed for a reason. Chapter 2. The proposal. The morning had broken grey and ominous. A heavy, damp wind swept across the ranch, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of impending rain. But there was no promise of relief in the cool, damp air, just the weight of a storm gathering on the horizon. Will Parker stood at the edge of the field, his broad back to the sky, watching as dark clouds rolled in, their shadows creeping across the land like a creeping threat. The cattle grazed listlessly on the dry, cracked earth, their once glossy coats dull from weeks of scorching sun and little water. The sound of distant thunder echoed faintly in the distance, but the storm was still too far off to bring any real comfort. The parched soil, the dying crops, and the thinning herd were all signs of what Will already knew in his gut. His family's legacy was slipping away. He tightened his jaw, feeling the familiar gnawing anxiety settle in his chest. For the last few months, the signs had been mounting. The crops had failed early this year, wilting before they had a chance to reach maturity. The river that ran through the ranch, once a reliable source of water, had dwindled to a mere trickle. And now a number of cattle were missing, lost to rustlers, or perhaps to the relentless drought, their bones scattered along the dry hillsides. The ranch was barely holding on. Will wiped the back of his hand across his brow, the dust mixing with the sweat from his skin. His eyes drifted toward the weathered barn in the distance, the roof sagging under the weight of neglect. It had been years since he had any help. His father's passing had left a void that he had struggled to fill on his own. The ranch was supposed to be his inheritance, the land he was meant to build on, to carry forward the pride of his father's name. But now, as the winds picked up, carrying with them the promise of rain, Will knew the truth. The storm wasn't just coming from the skies, it had already arrived in the form of crippling debt and the relentless toll of the land. The sound of hooves reached his ears, and he turned to see one of the hands, Jeb, riding toward him, his horse kicking up the dry earth in an effort to reach Will quickly. Jeb pulled up beside him, the lines of worry on his face evident even from a distance. The man's shoulders were slumped, as though the weight of the ranch's troubles had settled on him too. "Boss," Jeb said, tipping his hat as he slowed his horse, "we lost more cattle overnight. Found a few tracks near the east fence. Looks like they were driven off." Will's stomach tightened. Cattle rustling wasn't new to the ranch, but it had never come this close, never this bold. The ranch was supposed to be a fortress, his fortress, and now it was being eroded from all sides. "Damn it," Will muttered under his breath. His hand gripped the reins tighter, his knuckles turning white. "That's the third time this month." Jeb nodded grimly, his eyes flickering toward the thinning herd. "We've got nothing left to give, Will. And the crops ain't looking much better." Will's gaze moved to the horizon, to the far-off hills that had once seemed so full of promise. His mind raced, the weight of his father's legacy pressing down on him. The ranch had been in his family for generations, and he'd always believed that no matter how bad things got, he could make it work. But now, with rustlers taking what little he had left, and the land refusing to yield, it felt as though he were fighting a battle he couldn't win. "I'll take care of it," Will said, his voice low but firm. "Keep an eye on the rest of the herd. I'll head out to the east fence and see what I can do." Jeb hesitated, clearly torn between his loyalty to Will and the fear that this would be one more task he couldn't help with. "You sure you don't want me to go with you, Will? 2 men are better than 1, especially if we're dealing with rustlers." Will looked at him, the weight of their predicament heavy in his gaze. "You're needed here, Jeb. We've got to keep the herd together, and I can't afford to lose any more." With a brief nod, Jeb turned his horse back toward the ranch, the sound of hooves quickly fading as he moved away. Will stood alone for a moment longer, the storm on the horizon seeming to mock him. The cattle were being driven off, his crops withered, and the land refused to cooperate. Yet the ranch, his father's land, was all he had left. The fear of losing it, of losing everything he had worked for, made his chest tighten with frustration and helplessness. The wind began to pick up, the first signs of the storm reaching the land. Will turned and walked toward the ranch house, his boots heavy with the weight of his thoughts. As he entered the small study, the dim light inside did little to ease the tightening knot in his gut. The desk was cluttered with papers, debts, bills, and notices of overdue payments. He sat heavily in the worn chair, his fingers brushing the papers as his mind whirled. The ranch wasn't just in financial trouble, it was facing collapse. He had no idea how much longer he could keep the creditors at bay, how much longer he could keep up appearances that everything was fine. But the truth was unavoidable. Unless something drastic happened, The ranch was in danger of slipping through his fingers. He opened one of the bills, his eyes scanning the figures that only seemed to grow higher with each passing day. His father had been a man who never took out loans, who prided himself on living within his means, but Will hadn't inherited that same sense of caution. He had let the ranch fall into disrepair, convinced that his hard work could make it thrive again. But it was all catching up to him now. A storm rumbled in the distance, the sound vibrating through the walls, and Will's gaze lingered on the window. The rain wouldn't come soon enough, not for the crops, not for the cattle, not for the ranch. His pride, the thing that had kept him going all these years, was no longer enough. Something had to change. Something drastic. As the afternoon darkened, the first drops of rain began to fall, each one a reminder that no matter how much he tried to hold on, nature and life were indifferent to his struggle. He had one chance to save it all, one chance to turn the tide. He picked up a letter that had been sitting on the desk, a letter from Charlotte Montgomery, the widow. Her estate was thriving, or so the rumors said. Her name had come up more than once in recent weeks, a quiet reminder of someone who had the resources he so desperately needed. If Will could somehow secure her help, somehow convince her to enter into a business arrangement, a partnership of sorts, he might have a chance to save the ranch. But the thought of asking a woman like Charlotte for anything, let alone for her financial backing, stung his pride. She was wealthy, cultured, and far removed from his world. A widow, yes, but one who had everything she could need. To propose such an arrangement, to offer something so transactional, felt wrong. Still, the storm outside raged louder, and Will's thoughts became clearer. He had to set aside his pride. If he didn't act, if he didn't find a way to save his family's legacy, then what would be left? The ranch, his father's memory, would all slip away. He stood up, his decision made, the weight of it settling on his shoulders. It was time to make the proposal. He would seek out Charlotte Montgomery, and he would do whatever it took to convince her, because he was running out of time. The sky was a heavy, oppressive gray as Will Parker rode his horse toward the imposing Montgomery estate. The mansion loomed in the distance, its large columns rising like sentinels in the middle of the sprawling grounds. The once pristine gardens, though well-maintained, seemed to fade into the muted landscape, their vibrancy lost beneath the thick, low-hanging clouds. Even the stately structure seemed to groan under the weight of the coming storm, as if nature itself was bracing for the confrontation to come. Will's chest tightened as he drew closer to the mansion, the ground beneath his horse's hooves turning soft and yielding from the rain that had fallen earlier. The contrast between his rough-hewn appearance, weathered, worn, and carrying the dust of the ranch, and the pristine elegance of the estate could not have been starker. His boots, scuffed and cracked from long hours in the saddle, sank into the mud slightly as he dismounted, adjusting his worn coat as he stared up at the large front door. The mansion's opulence felt almost oppressive now, a reminder of the chasm between him and Charlotte Montgomery's world. Will had ridden over the rough roads without hesitation, his mind set on the one course of action that could save his family's legacy. The ranch was in dire straits, and the debts were piling up, each new letter from creditors a reminder that his time was running out. He had heard rumors of Charlotte's estate, how it was flourishing under her careful management, how she had resources he could never have imagined in his wildest dreams. This was his last chance. He needed her. As he approached the grand front door, he paused, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea how she would react to his proposal. He was no fool. He knew she was a woman of means, of social standing, and his request would likely be an insult to her, an affront to everything she had worked for. But desperation had brought him here, and if it meant swallowing his pride for the sake of saving the ranch, then so be it. The door swung open before he could knock, and there she stood, Charlotte Montgomery. Her figure was framed in the doorway, bathed in the soft light of the dim hallway behind her, her presence elegant and commanding even in the quiet of the moment. Her posture was poised, regal, and her eyes, those dark eyes, held a quiet strength that seemed to look straight through him, reading him as though he were an open book. "Mr. Parker," she said, her voice smooth but guarded, "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," Will replied, his voice rough from the ride, his hands resting at his sides, unsure of how to proceed. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "You're not," Charlotte answered, though the coolness of her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Please come in." She stepped aside, allowing him entry. Will's boots clicked softly against the polished floor as he followed her down a long corridor, the sound echoing in the stillness of the house. They passed through a large, open parlor, the muted light from heavy drapes casting long shadows over the room. The air was thick with the scent of rich wood and polished furniture, the elegance of the room a sharp contrast to Will's rough demeanor. He felt out of place, his weathered coat and dusty trousers a stark contrast to the delicate fabric of her gown, the graceful movements she made as she led him toward a small sitting room. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the wind outside and the occasional rattle of the windows as the storm began to gather strength. The walls were adorned with paintings of landscapes and ancestors long since gone, their gazes cold and watchful. Charlotte gestured to a chair, and Will took it, his posture stiff as he sat across from her, the distance between them palpable, both physical and emotional. For a long moment, neither spoke. Will struggled to find the right words, his thoughts a jumble of desperation, pride, and fear. He had rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times in his head, but now, in her presence, the reality of it felt like a weight he could hardly bear. Charlotte sat opposite him, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. The faintest flicker of curiosity danced in her eyes, but there was a quiet caution to her every movement. "I'm not here to waste your time, Miss Montgomery," Will began, his voice low and direct, though it carried the weight of what he was about to say. "The ranch, it's in trouble. Bad trouble." He paused, letting the gravity of the words settle between them. "I'm running out of options, and I've come to you because you have what I don't." Charlotte's brow furrowed slightly, her lips pressing together in an unreadable line. "I don't understand," she said, her voice soft but sharp. "What do you think I can offer that will solve your problems, Mr. Parker?" Will exhaled slowly, his gaze falling to his hands as they clenched tightly in his lap. "I need your help, your financial backing. And your name." Her gaze flickered briefly to his hands, the rough, calloused fingers clenched in his lap, as though he were holding something back. She regarded him for a moment, her expression a mask of calm, before she spoke again. "What are you proposing?" Charlotte's voice was measured, careful. "You cannot possibly expect me to simply give you what you need without any consideration." He met her gaze then, his eyes dark with the weight of his decision. "I'm not asking for charity, Miss Montgomery. I'm asking for a partnership, a marriage of convenience. In exchange for your financial help, your name will provide the security my ranch needs. Your standing in society can help me keep creditors off my back long enough to turn things around." Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly, and she leaned forward, the fine lace of her gown rustling as she shifted. "And in return, what exactly do you expect of me, Mr. Parker? Do you expect me to give up my life, my name, my entire way of living for the sake of your ranch?" Will hesitated. His chest tightened as he forced himself to speak. "I expect you to do what's best for both of us. I know this isn't a traditional arrangement, but we both stand to benefit." The words hung in the air, laden with more than just practicality. They carried with them the weight of his desperation, and Charlotte felt the faintest tremor in her own chest as she absorbed them. She looked at him then, really looked at him at the set of his jaw, the storm in his eyes, the weight of the man who had carried his family's legacy on his shoulders for far too long. She saw the quiet strength in him, the raw honesty. His pride, she realized, was as much a burden as it was a shield. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, the silence stretching between them as she considered his words. Will watched her closely, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing. He knew he was treading dangerous ground, but it was the only path left to him. Finally Charlotte spoke, her voice softer now, her eyes a little more open, the rigidity of her earlier stance beginning to thaw. "I will consider your proposal," she said slowly, her gaze holding his. "But I need you to understand something, Will. This arrangement will not be easy. It will require more than just a financial agreement. It will require both of us to surrender something we hold dear. And you must be certain this is the only way forward." Will nodded, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be simple, but he also knew he had no other choice. "I'm certain," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I'm certain this is the only way forward." And in that moment both of them knew that the proposal wasn't just about saving a ranch or securing a name. It was about finding something neither of them had expected, a connection forged not just in necessity, but in a quiet, unspoken understanding of the burdens each of them carried. The sun rose over the ranch in a soft wash of gold, its light spilling across the weathered homestead as though to erase the shadows of the past. The horizon, touched by the delicate hues of morning, seemed to promise a fresh start, as though the land itself was awakening to new possibilities. The air was crisp with the promise of spring, carrying with it a faint scent of damp earth and fresh grass. A new day had begun, and with it, a new chapter in the lives of Will Parker and Charlotte Montgomery. Will stood outside the ranch house, his hands resting on the railing of the porch, gazing out at the sprawling landscape before him. The land, still stubborn, still weary from the years of neglect, held a certain raw beauty, a beauty that he had always known but now saw with fresh eyes. The weight of his decision settled into his chest as he looked toward the barn, where the work would begin. A partnership had been forged, one that had altered the very course of his life. He had never imagined he would find himself here, working side by side with a woman like Charlotte Montgomery, but now that it was reality, he couldn't deny the stirrings of hope that began to take root within him. The sound of hooves approaching brought his gaze back to the present, and his heart skipped a beat as he saw Charlotte riding toward him. She sat tall and graceful in the saddle, her dark hair flowing behind her like a ribbon of midnight against the pale sky. Dressed in a riding habit that was both practical and elegant, she was a striking figure, someone who seemed as much at home in the saddle as in the drawing rooms of society. Will could hardly believe she had agreed to this partnership, to this life that would pull her away from the comforts and familiarity of her world. She pulled up beside him, her horse snorting softly, and glanced down at him with a look of quiet determination in her eyes. "Ready to get to work?" she asked, her voice steady and calm, but beneath the surface he could hear the subtle tension of someone stepping into unfamiliar territory. Will nodded, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "As ready as I'll ever be," he said, his voice rough with the weight of their new beginning. "We've got a lot of ground to cover, but it's a start." They moved together toward the barn, the morning light illuminating their path as they began the day's work. Will could feel Charlotte's presence beside him, an unfamiliar yet somehow welcome force. This was more than just a business arrangement, more than just two people coming together out of necessity. Something new was taking root between them, a subtle shift that neither of them could yet name. The first task of the day was repairing the fences that had begun to sag in places, the wood warped from years of exposure to the harsh sun. Will showed Charlotte how to measure and cut the posts, how to secure them tightly in the ground, to ensure they would hold up against the wind and the weight of the cattle. Her movements were hesitant at first, her fingers stiff with unfamiliarity, but she listened intently, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of his instructions. Will had always worked alone. He had learned early on that the ranch was his responsibility and his alone, but he found himself appreciating the way Charlotte approached the task. Her focus was meticulous, her determination evident in the way she handled the tools with precision. "You've got the hang of this faster than I expected," Will said with a quiet chuckle, watching her nail in the last post with an ease that belied her initial uncertainty. Charlotte gave a small smile, brushing a strand of hair from her face as she straightened up. "I suppose I'm a quick study when the stakes are high," she replied, her voice steady despite the sweat gathering at the nape of her neck. "I've never been one to shy away from hard work." Will couldn't help but admire her in that moment, this woman who had come from a life of luxury and ease, yet was willing to roll up her sleeves and get her hands dirty for the sake of their new venture. She was more than just a woman of wealth and privilege, she was someone who understood the value of what they were building, someone who was willing to put in the effort to make it work. After finishing the fencing, they moved on to the next task, overseeing the water sources. Will led her to the small creek that ran along the far edge of the property, the water barely flowing after the long drought. He showed her the irrigation system he had put in place, explaining how they could manage the water flow more efficiently to preserve what little they had left. Charlotte listened closely, asking questions about the logistics and the costs involved, her sharp mind absorbing the details with ease. "You've been running this place alone for a long time, haven't you?" Charlotte remarked as she studied the makeshift irrigation system, the realization of Will's solitude dawning on her. Will paused, his gaze shifting to the horizon as he thought of the years he had spent fighting this battle on his own. "Since my father passed, it's been a struggle," he admitted quietly, the words feeling heavier than he had expected. "But I never thought of giving up. This land, it's in my blood. I couldn't walk away from it." Charlotte watched him for a long moment, her expression softening. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice carrying a quiet understanding. "I've spent my life holding on to things that were meant to be left behind. Perhaps that's why I'm here now." Will turned his head to look at her, his gaze locking with hers. There was something in her eyes, something raw and unspoken, that resonated with him. He nodded slowly, as if to acknowledge the shared weight of their burdens, the silent understanding between them. As the day wore on, the contrast between their worlds became ever more apparent. While they worked together in the rugged environment of the ranch, Charlotte could not help but think of her own world, the manicured gardens and polished floors of her estate, the genteel expectations of society. She was used to the soft rhythms of tea parties and social gatherings, not the heavy, physical labor that this new life demanded. The scenes alternated between the raw, earthy environment of the ranch and the refined interiors of Charlotte's estate. In the quiet of the estate's drawing room, Charlotte sat at a large, polished desk, her hands moving swiftly over ledgers, carefully calculating the costs of their supplies and making a list of potential investors. She found a certain satisfaction in the task, a sense of control over the chaos of the ranch that had always eluded her before. The crisp paper, the delicate lines of ink, the elegance of the surroundings, it was a stark contrast to the dusty, rough reality of the ranch. Yet here, as she worked beside Will, she realized how both worlds were beginning to blend, how each skill they brought to the table complemented the other. Back at the ranch, Will spent hours overseeing the cattle, ensuring that the herd was well managed and that the water was flowing properly. The sweat of his labor soaked through his shirt, his muscles aching from the demands of the day, but there was a satisfaction in the work, an undeniable sense that, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone in this fight. Charlotte's presence, her willingness to take on the hard work, made all the difference. As evening fell, the two of them stood side by side, looking over the land they were now building together. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, amber glow over the ranch. Will felt the weight of the day's labor, but also the flicker of hope that had begun to burn brighter within him. "You're not what I expected," he said quietly, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth. "But I think we're going to make it work, Charlotte." Charlotte turned to him, her eyes soft with something unspoken. "I never expected this either," she replied, her voice a quiet reflection of the change that was happening between them. "But I believe in it, Will. I believe in what we're building here." And as the stars began to twinkle overhead, they both knew that their worlds had begun to merge in a way neither could have anticipated, a blending of raw, earthbound reality and refined, careful planning. Together they would build something new, something stronger than either of them had imagined. The early weeks of their partnership passed in a blur of hard work and small victories. Each day seemed to bring new challenges, yet with every challenge came progress. The ranch, once languishing under the weight of neglect and misfortune, began to show the first signs of life again. Under Will's careful eye and Charlotte's meticulous planning, the irrigation system had been fully implemented. Streams of water now flowed steadily through channels he had never dared hope would be fully functional again. Where the land had once been cracked and dry, the earth had begun to soften, green shoots sprouting along the edges of the irrigation ditches. Charlotte had managed to procure the necessary supplies from the local merchants, overseeing the logistics with the same precision she had applied to every other aspect of her life. The balance of their efforts, Will's experience with the land, and Charlotte's ability to organize had begun to pay off in tangible ways. The cattle, too, were improving. The herd was lean, their ribs still showing from the worst of the drought, but their coats were shinier, their steps stronger. Will had implemented a strict feeding schedule and placed extra emphasis on the health of the calves. It was a slow recovery, but every day brought a small but significant improvement. As Will walked through the barnyard, the sound of hooves clomping on the dirt filled his ears, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something that resembled hope. One afternoon, as they gathered to discuss the progress of their various projects, Will stood in the center of the barnyard, addressing the ranch hands. Charlotte was beside him, holding the ledger with the tally of supplies and new expenditures, her sharp eyes scanning the group. The men, grizzled and weathered from years of ranch work, were cautious, their faces drawn with skepticism and doubt. But even they couldn't deny the improvements that had been made since Charlotte had come to the ranch. "Things are looking better," Mr. Parker Jebb, the oldest ranch hand, spoke up from the back of the group. "Cattle seem stronger, and the water's finally flowing again. The creek's looking like it's going to hold up this year. We've seen better days, that's for sure." Will glanced at Charlotte, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He felt a flicker of pride, and the faintest stir of something more as he caught her gaze. "We've got a long road ahead," Will said, his voice steady, "but I believe we've laid the groundwork for something good. Keep it up, and we'll make it through." The men nodded, some of them exchanging glances of cautious optimism. The ranch, once a place of only hard work and bitter frustration, now held the promise of prosperity. Charlotte's presence, her ability to organize, and her unshakable resolve had given them all something to believe in again. As the days passed, the shared moments between Will and Charlotte grew. It was not the grand gestures of romance, but the small, subtle connections that began to take root. There was the way Charlotte would pass him a tool when he needed it, their fingers brushing for a fleeting second. There were the quiet moments in the barn, where they would work side by side without speaking, the rhythm of their efforts harmonizing with the sounds of the ranch. Their shared laughter over a minor mishap, when Charlotte's hat had been knocked off by a low-hanging branch as she had followed Will to check the irrigation ditches, became a memory they would both revisit in the quiet moments when they were alone. It was in those fleeting glances, those unexpected smiles, that a bond began to form. Neither of them acknowledged it out loud, but it was there, subtle and undeniable. Will found himself looking forward to those quiet exchanges, where Charlotte's presence wasn't just a necessity but a comfort. She was no longer just the woman who had come to save his ranch, she was someone he had come to rely on in a way he had never expected. He saw the quiet strength in her, the resilience she carried with her, even in the face of doubt and uncertainty. She was more than just a business partner, she was someone who, in her own way, had become a part of his world. Charlotte, too, found herself drawn to Will in a way she had not anticipated. She had come to the ranch with a plan, with a clear goal in mind to save the land, to restore her own sense of purpose, and she had thought little beyond that. But Will's quiet determination, his unwavering commitment to the land, was something she had not expected. There was a steadiness in him that anchored her, a strength that she found herself trusting, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. As dusk settled over the ranch, the sun dipping below the horizon, both Will and Charlotte found themselves standing in silence, each lost in their own thoughts as they looked over the land. The day had been full of progress, small victories that had slowly started to accumulate. The irrigation channels were flowing smoothly, the cattle were thriving, and the ranch hands had begun to share in the hope that had once felt so impossible. Will stood at the edge of the pasture, his hands resting on the worn fence post, watching as the last of the cattle returned to the barn for the evening. The sky above him was painted in shades of lavender and gold, the wind carrying the earthy scent of the land as it rustled through the tall grass. The world seemed at peace, and for the first time in a long while, Will felt as though he could finally breathe. But as he stood there, lost in the quiet of the evening, his thoughts turned to Charlotte. He had come to this partnership with nothing but a sense of desperation, but somewhere along the way, he had begun to admire her in a way he hadn't expected. She was unlike anyone he had ever known, strong, capable, and determined, yet beneath that exterior, there was a quiet vulnerability that spoke to him in ways he couldn't fully explain. He found himself drawn to her, not just because she had saved the ranch, but because of the way she had become a part of his world, a world he had never imagined he'd share with anyone. He glanced over his shoulder to find her standing a few feet away, her face turned to the sky, her features soft in the fading light. There was a quiet grace to her even in these simple moments, a grace that made his chest tighten in ways he couldn't quite name. Charlotte turned to meet his gaze, her eyes soft but steady. She took a step toward him, the fading light catching the delicate strands of hair that had come loose from her pinned-up style. "I never thought this place could be like this," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking the thought aloud might break the spell of the moment. "It's different now." Will's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "It's not perfect yet, but we're getting there." Charlotte nodded, her gaze resting on the land before them. "And we will," she said with quiet conviction. "Together." There was something in her words, in the way she said them, that made Will's heart quicken. He wasn't sure what it was, maybe the unspoken understanding that had grown between them, or maybe the way she had become someone he couldn't imagine doing this without. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, and for the briefest moment, Will and Charlotte stood in silence, each feeling the weight of the day's work, but also the promise of what lay ahead. It wasn't just the ranch that was growing something else, something quieter, something more fragile was blossoming between them. And as they turned back to the ranch house side by side, there was no doubt in either of their minds that the foundation of something far more lasting was being built, day by day. Something that could withstand not just the storms of nature, but the storms of their hearts. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Facade. The early morning light cast a soft golden glow across the ranch, but beneath its warmth, a restless wind stirred the dust, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. The air, dry and sharp, flickered with the promise of change, though the storm that seemed to hang over the land had yet to materialize. Will Parker stood at the far edge of the pasture, his gaze fixed on the land before him as the breeze whipped through the tall grass. The sight was beautiful, but the unease creeping through his veins was impossible to ignore. He could feel it, that sense that something just out of reach was shifting. The wind carried it, sharp and biting, like the first taste of winter on a fall morning. He turned his back on the land for a moment, pushing open the rickety barn door. Inside, the low hum of the cattle echoed off the wooden walls, their lowing a reminder of how much was at stake. Things had been improving slowly but surely, but Will knew, deep down, that the ranch was far from safe. The wind howled again, and he felt the weight of uncertainty settle over him. Charlotte had been working at her desk in the house for most of the morning, her focus on the logistics of the ranch, her sharp mind calculating expenses and inventory. She had been more distant lately, buried under the weight of her own private concerns. Will couldn't help but notice the way her eyes had seemed to drift at times, her focus waning as if something was pulling at her, just out of sight. He didn't know what it was, but he felt it too, something shifting between them. Something that had nothing to do with the ranch. It was then that Jeb rode up, his horse kicking up dust as he approached, his face more drawn than usual. Will straightened, noting the tense lines of the older ranch hand's features. "Morning, Will," Jeb said, his voice tight, his hat pulled low over his brow. "Got something to tell ya. Ain't sure what it means, but figured you'd want to know." Will's brow furrowed, sensing the weight in Jeb's words. "What is it?" Jeb paused, looking over his shoulder toward the distant hills, as if the earth itself might be listening. "Heard some talk. Word's been spreading about McLean again. Word is he's pushing in further staking claims closer to the western borders. He's got some men out there working at night, fixing up fences and building more water troughs. Something don't feel right about it." Will's jaw clenched. Brock McLean, his biggest rival, was always looking for ways to expand his holdings, to elbow out smaller ranchers like Will. The news wasn't new, but the timing was troubling. Will had managed to keep McLean at bay with some careful negotiation, but the signs now pointed to an escalation, a move from the shadows to something more direct. "You think he's trying to take my land?" Will asked, his voice quiet, though the tension was palpable. "I don't know, but there's been talk of it," Jeb replied, his voice grave. "And it's not just McLean. There's whispers of something else, corrupt officials in town working with him. Some of the local lawmen even. If they're in his pocket, it's going to be harder to stop him this time." The weight of Jeb's words settled like a stone in Will's gut. McLean's influence was growing, and if the rumors were true, the local authorities might not be the ally Will had hoped for. But McLean's maneuvering wasn't the only danger. At the same time, Charlotte sat in the study of the mansion, her fingers running over the edges of the paper in front of her. The ledger was meticulously organized, but it was the papers that she had received earlier letters from her trusted financial advisor that now consumed her thoughts. She'd been putting it off for days, avoiding what she feared might be the truth. Charlotte glanced at the door, ensuring she was alone before unsealing the envelope again, her eyes scanning the lines of ink. The words were clipped, businesslike, but they carried an edge she could not ignore. Hidden debts. Unauthorized withdrawals. A pattern of irregularities that began years ago after Nathaniel's death. She had trusted her advisor, but now, it seemed the accounts had been manipulated in ways she couldn't quite piece together. The amount was staggering. Her breath caught as she read further, the implications of it all settling into her chest like a cold weight. The very man she had entrusted to manage her estate had been embezzling funds, siphoning off money from the estate's coffers, and leaving her with little recourse to recover it. She had suspected something was amiss in the past month, small inconsistencies here and there, but nothing so damning. Charlotte's hands trembled as she set the letter down, her mind racing through the possibilities. She had been so focused on the ranch and its progress with Will that she hadn't given herself the space to truly see what was happening right in front of her. She felt the sharp sting of betrayal. The sense of trust she had placed in the people closest to her was crumbling, and with it, her belief in the stability she had so carefully cultivated. She had been so caught up in the tasks of running the estate, in doing what was expected of her, that she had missed the cracks forming around her. She felt foolish, vulnerable. But she had to be strong now. She had to fix this both for the sake of the ranch and for the future that she had started to imagine with Will. The day had begun with the promise of new beginnings, of plans set in motion. But now, as the wind outside began to pick up again, Will and Charlotte found themselves standing at the edge of their respective worlds, each of them facing a different form of betrayal, a different shadow creeping in around the edges of their lives. As dusk fell, casting long shadows across the land, Will leaned against the fence, looking out over the ranch. The cattle were grazing lazily in the fields and the barn stood strong against the wind. But beneath the surface, there was a gnawing feeling in his gut. McLean's maneuvers were a threat, but there was more at play here. The quiet war had begun, and he wasn't sure who he could trust. Inside, Charlotte sat at her desk, the light from the oil lamp casting long shadows on the pages before her. The estate that had once felt like her sanctuary now seemed to close in on her, its walls threatening to suffocate her. There was more than just the ranch at stake now. There were secrets that had been buried for too long. Her trust had been betrayed, and the person responsible was someone she had never suspected. As the evening wore on, both of them found themselves caught between duty and the growing tension in their hearts. Will had come to Charlotte for help, to merge their lives in the name of saving the ranch. But now both of them were facing enemies external and internal that threatened everything they had built. The foundations they had worked so hard to lay were beginning to crack, and the storm on the horizon was not just about the land, it was about everything they had yet to confront. The wind howled again outside, a reminder that the storm had only just begun. The late afternoon sky hung heavy with clouds, their dark bellies threatening rain, yet the only sound that could be heard was the restless wind that rattled the dying leaves on the trees and the low, mournful creak of the barn doors. The atmosphere at the ranch felt as oppressive as the sky above, a reflection of the tension that simmered between Will and Charlotte. They stood in the middle of the barnyard, facing each other, the open space between them filled with unsaid words. Will, his face drawn and tense, wiped his brow with the back of his hand, his eyes narrowed against the wind. Charlotte, standing a few paces away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, looked every bit the woman of society proud, poised, yet underneath it all, her worry was clear. She was a stranger in this world, and it was becoming more apparent with every passing day. "What's the plan then, Will?" Charlotte asked, her voice calm but edged with frustration. "You keep pushing me away and I can't make sense of any of it. The ranch is in trouble, and I'm trying to help, but you refuse to let me." Will's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening as the words left her lips. "I never asked for help in the first place, Charlotte," he shot back, his voice low but heated. "I never asked for you to come in here and start making decisions like you own the place. This is my land, my responsibility, not yours." Charlotte's breath caught, a flash of hurt crossing her face before she masked it with steely resolve. "And what exactly are you doing, Will?" she retorted, stepping closer. "You're not even listening to the advice I'm giving you. We're barely scraping by. You've put us in a corner with your pride and your stubbornness. If you would just let me help, we could actually make progress." A crackling silence filled the air between them, and the wind howled louder, almost as if it were adding to the weight of their confrontation. The dilapidated barn loomed behind them, its sagging walls a stark metaphor for the fragile foundation of their union. Their relationship born of necessity, not love, had never been easy, but this was different. The words between them had grown sharper, more biting, and the trust that had been slowly built over the last several months seemed to be crumbling. Will's temper flared, his fist clenched, the anger in his voice sharp. "I'm not some damn fool, Charlotte. I've been running this ranch for years alone, and I'll be damned if I let you come in here and tell me how to do it. You think I don't know what's at stake? I know better than anyone what it takes to keep this place alive. But maybe, just maybe, I don't need someone like you questioning every decision I make." Charlotte recoiled from the venom in his words, her face pale as she took a step back. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her thoughts spinning. "You think I'm questioning you?" Her voice trembled, though she fought to keep it steady. "I'm trying to help, Will. I've been helping, working alongside you, doing everything I can, and this is how you treat me." Will was silent for a moment, his gaze hardening as he looked at her. The anger in his chest still simmered, but beneath it was something deeper, a guilt that gnawed at him. The realization that the walls he had built around himself were pushing Charlotte away. But he couldn't let it go. Not now. Not when everything he had fought for was on the line. "I didn't ask you to come here and be my savior, Charlotte," he muttered, his voice rougher now. "You don't know what it's like to carry this burden, to be responsible for everything." Charlotte's eyes flashed with the hurt that had been building in her chest for weeks now. She had tried so hard to fit into his world, to make herself useful, to prove that she could handle the tough work, but she had always been kept at arm's length. "Then what is this, Will?" she asked softly, her voice filled with a quiet sorrow. "What exactly are we doing here? You can't even see it, can you? You can't see how we're both struggling, how we're both carrying too much. I'm not trying to be your savior, but I am trying to be your partner, and I can't do that if you keep shutting me out." Her words landed like a blow, and Will felt the sting of her truth. He couldn't deny it, he had been shutting her out. His pride, his fear of failure, had made him push her away even as he needed her more than ever. But in that moment he saw the toll it had taken on her, the way she had tried to help, tried to stand by him, and how his actions had only driven a wedge between them. The air between them thickened with the weight of their unspoken emotions, but neither spoke. Their gazes locked, the storm brewing in both of their hearts, and neither was ready to confront the full force of what lay beneath the surface. That evening, after the confrontation had passed, and the tension still hung in the air like a storm cloud, Will retreated to the solitude of the ranch's main building. He shut the door behind him with more force than he intended, the sound echoing through the empty halls. His chest was tight with frustration, guilt, and anger. But there was something else buried beneath it all, something he couldn't name. Something that whispered to him, reminding him that the person he had been pushing away was the one person who had the potential to make things right. He walked through the darkened hallways, the creaking floorboards beneath his boots a reminder of the weight of his responsibilities. Every decision, every turn he had taken had led him to this place of fractured trust and strained relationships. And yet, as he stood there, in the heart of the ranch, the weight of it all felt unbearable. He had been so certain that he could fix things on his own, that he could make it all work by sheer force of will. But now, with Charlotte's words echoing in his mind, he wondered if he had been wrong. Outside, the sky had darkened further, the wind picking up in anticipation of the storm. Will grabbed his hat and walked out the back door, heading toward the stables. He needed space. He needed to clear his mind, to think, to regain some semblance of control over the chaos inside him. A solitary ride through the field seemed like the only escape from the weight of the day. As he rode, the cold wind whipped against his face, and the emptiness of the vast landscape spread out before him, like an expanse that mirrored his own turmoil. He had always found solace in the land, in the rhythm of the work, but today it felt different. Today the quiet only amplified the chaos in his chest. Meanwhile, Charlotte, too, had retreated into her own solitude. She wandered through the manicured gardens of the estate, her steps slow and deliberate, as she traced the paths she had walked countless times before. The flowers, though still blooming in vibrant hues, seemed to mock her, a reminder of the world she had once known, one where everything was in its place, and the future seemed certain. Now, her life felt as fragmented as the broken pieces of her trust in Will. As she walked, her mind replayed the argument, the words they had exchanged, and the underlying truth that neither of them was ready to face. Could they rebuild what had been broken? Could they truly come together in the way they both needed, despite the cracks that had appeared in the foundation of their relationship? As the storm clouds gathered overhead, Charlotte paused in the quiet of the garden, the breeze tugging at her skirts. For a moment, everything seemed still. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, one that neither she nor Will could avoid for long. The weight of the day settled over them both, and they each wondered, as the evening grew darker, whether their union born of necessity and held together by fragile threads could withstand the pressure of the secrets, doubts, and betrayals they had yet to face. Will sat alone on the sagging porch of the ranch house, his shoulders hunched, his hands wrapped around a half-drunk cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The landscape before him was barren, the earth cracked and dry under the oppressive heat. The wind that blew through the parched fields was little more than a dry whisper, carrying the scent of dust and desperation. The horizon was a pale, colorless blur, and for the first time, Will couldn't find the strength to look beyond it. The ranch had once thrived, a proud testament to the Parker family's hard work. But now the land felt like a weight he couldn't shake. The cattle were thinner, the grass had long since turned to brittle straw, and the river that had once run and clear had dried up, leaving only a ghost of its former self. Will's eyes traced the familiar worn fence lines that ran across the fields, their edges crumbling in places where the earth had sunk too deep. He had spent years building, years fighting to maintain his family's legacy, but now it all seemed like a cruel joke. Every morning he fought to keep the ranch together. Every night he lay awake, unable to silence the thought that he might be failing. The bills continued to pile up, the notices from creditors demanding what he could not give, and the rustlers, those damn thieves, had grown bolder, creeping in from the hills to take what little he had left. He had caught them once or twice, but each time they came they were more cunning, more elusive. The thought of them getting away with it, of losing even more of his livestock, was enough to twist his stomach into knots. He set the empty cup down on the porch step, his fingers tight around the edge, as if holding on to something. Anything to keep himself anchored. The weight of his family's legacy pressed down on him like a boulder, the years of hard work, of sacrifices, threatening to slip through his fingers like sand. He had promised his father he would keep the ranch alive, and yet here he was, watching it die piece by piece, a silent witness to his failure. Inside the estate, Charlotte sat in the dimly lit sitting room, the flickering light from the hearth casting long shadows on the walls. The mansion, grand and imposing as it was, felt like a cage today, its silence overwhelming. The warm, golden glow from the fire did little ease the cold knot forming in her chest. She had always prided herself on her ability to manage, on her control over the estate's finances, but now, as she pored over the financial ledgers and stacks of correspondence, she could no longer pretend that everything was in order. The numbers didn't add up. She had known there were discrepancies in the past, small things here and there that had never seemed significant, but now they loomed over her like a storm on the horizon. Her financial advisor's letters, once reassuring and filled with promises, now read like hollow words. The withdrawals, the unauthorized transfers, there was no explaining them away. And with each passing day, her sense of betrayal deepened. Had she been deceived, or had she simply ignored the signs of a growing crisis? The realization hit her with a sharp pang of guilt. She had trusted him, relied on him to guide her, to manage the estate while she focused on the ranch and its revival. But now it was clear that her trust had been misplaced. The estate, her only true source of security, was far more fragile than she had realized. Her fingers trembled as she reached for another letter, a notice from one of the banks she had been working with, demanding immediate payment. She had always believed her wealth would see her through, but now she wondered if she had been living in a fragile bubble, too focused on keeping up appearances and ignoring the cracks beneath the surface. She had placed her faith in the wrong people, and now the consequences were closing in on her. She could already see the edges of her carefully constructed life starting to crumble, just as Will's ranch was slipping from his grasp. As evening fell, both Will and Charlotte found themselves alone in their respective worlds, each struggling with the weight of their respective failures. Will had spent the day overseeing the few remaining cattle, trying desperately to find ways to hold on to what he had left, but there was no escaping the growing fear that he was fighting a losing battle. With every step, with every task he completed, the land seemed to fight back harder, the drought pushing them both closer to the edge. He knew Charlotte was doing everything she could, but even her support couldn't make the ground beneath them any less brittle. The ranch was slipping, and he could feel the abyss growing closer with every passing day. The sky outside had darkened, the low clouds reflecting the weight of the day's struggle. Will stood in the barn, looking out over the horizon, his thoughts a tangled mess. He hadn't realized how much he had relied on Charlotte's presence until the silence began to creep in. Without her, there was a hollowness to his efforts, a sense that he was working in the dark, unable to see the path ahead. He pushed the thought aside and grabbed a pencil, turning to the rough sketches of the irrigation system he had been drawing for days. The water had been a constant issue, and he had to find a way to fix it, to make sure they didn't lose the last of their resources. His mind churned with calculations and ideas, but there was something else, something deeper that drove him, his family's legacy. His father had built this ranch from nothing, and he was determined not to let it fall. No matter the cost, no matter how hard he had to fight, he wouldn't let his father's legacy die. At the same time, Charlotte wandered through the overgrown garden of her estate, her pace slow, deliberate. The gardens, once meticulously tended, had fallen into neglect in recent months. The flowers were wilting, the hedges untamed. It seemed a reflection of the way she had been living, holding onto things that no longer served her, too focused on appearances and not enough on what truly mattered. As she walked, her thoughts turned inward. The estate was in trouble, and so was the ranch. She could no longer ignore the facts, the mounting evidence that her choices had led them both into this pit. She had wanted to be independent, to prove to herself that she could succeed on her own terms, but now, standing among the dying flowers, she wondered if her pride had been her undoing. Had she made the right decisions? Had she ignored the warning signs? She paused at a bench in the far corner of the garden, sitting down with a deep sigh. Her fingers rested on the edge of the seat, the cool air rustling through the leaves. She had always been taught to be composed, to keep control, but now, in the quiet solitude of the garden, all of her carefully constructed walls began to crack. She wasn't just fighting for the estate, she was fighting for her own sense of purpose, for the future that she had imagined. The thought of Will and his determination flickered in her mind. She had come here to help him, to rebuild, and in the process, she had found something in herself she hadn't known was there, a strength she had buried under the weight of societal expectations. But now, with the estate teetering on the brink of collapse and Will's ranch struggling, she realized that it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking control of her fate, of forging a new path forward. In the quiet of the garden, Charlotte made a decision. She would fight for the future she wanted, not just for the estate, not just for the ranch, but for herself. Later that night, both Will and Charlotte sat alone in their respective spaces, their minds filled with plans and resolutions. Will, seated at his desk in the ranch house, scribbled down ideas for managing the water supply and reinforcing the fences. He would find a way to make this work, no matter how long it took. Charlotte, back in her study, reorganized the ledgers and sent out letters to contacts she had once thought of as allies. She was done waiting for someone else to fix things. She would rebuild, and she would do it her way. As the night stretched on, both of them felt the weight of the day's struggle, but they also felt a spark, small but undeniable. The first signs that, despite everything, they were beginning to fight for a future for themselves and for each other. Chapter 4. The Turning Point. Will had barely finished the day's chores when the first rumble of thunder split the sky. He stood still for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. The storm had come without warning, as it often did in the west. 1 minute the air was dry and oppressive, and the next, the wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of rain and something darker. The cattle were restless, their lowing filling the air as the first fat raindrops splattered on the dirt. The barn door creaked as the wind swept through the cracks, and Will's mind, already burdened with the weight of the ranch's troubles, grew heavier. He had hoped for a reprieve, for some sign that things might get easier. But just as the storm darkened the sky, a new threat appeared, one that had been slowly creeping closer without his realizing. He wiped his hand across his brow, feeling the familiar weight of anxiety settle in his chest. The problem with the water source had been growing steadily more urgent. The creek that ran through the ranch was barely a trickle, barely enough to keep the cattle fed. And now, to make matters worse, the reports had started coming in from the north. McLean. That man had never been satisfied with what he had, and now it seemed he was taking advantage of Will's weakening position to make a bolder move. Will had heard the rumors before of McLean and his hired men moving closer to the water source, starting to claim land that had once been his. But it wasn't until he'd received word from Jeb, the ranch hand, that the true scale of the threat became clear. McLean was positioning himself to take the waterway entirely. He'd built makeshift dams upstream, diverting the flow and putting the rest of the ranch in danger. Will's heart dropped into his stomach. This was more than just land, this was the lifeblood of the ranch. Without water, there would be no cattle. Without cattle, there would be no ranch. He stood for a long moment, his thoughts racing, the wind whipping the dust around him as the storm began to bear down harder. He had been trying to keep this place afloat, trying to hold on to the legacy his father had left him. But now the weight of it all pressed down on him. McLean's move had taken things to a new level, one that couldn't be ignored. Back at the estate, Charlotte sat in her study, surrounded by the heavy silence of the grand home. She had spent hours poring over ledgers and letters, trying to untangle the mess of her financial affairs. But despite the calm of the surroundings, a storm had begun to gather in her own heart. The quiet whispers from her circle of acquaintances were growing louder, and with each passing day the weight of her decisions became more and more apparent. The news of McLean's aggressive move had reached her ear, carried on the wind of gossip that seemed to spread faster than the truth. But it wasn't just the rival rancher's actions that had her on edge. A letter from her financial advisor lay open on the desk in front of her, and its contents struck at the very core of her fears. There were discrepancies in her book's money missing, funds diverted to accounts she didn't recognize. A betrayal that she had trusted one she couldn't ignore any longer. Her hand trembled as she picked up the letter again, reading the same damning words, unable to reconcile the numbers with the life she had built. How had she allowed it to go this far? How had she failed to see what was happening right under her nose? She had been so focused on her own responsibilities, so determined to prove herself, that she had neglected the one thing she should have paid the closest attention to, the integrity of her financial foundations. It was then that a knock on the door broke her reverie, and she looked up to see Thomas, her trusted messenger, standing in the doorway, his face lined with urgency. "Miss Montgomery," he said, stepping inside with a letter in his hand. "This just came for you from the ranch." Will sent it. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat, and she quickly took the letter from his hand. She had never been so eager for news from Will until now. Something had changed, and she felt it deep in her bones. As she broke the seal and read his words, the room seemed to darken around her, and the weight of the situation came crashing down. Will's message was simple, but filled with urgency. McLean had made his move, and the water source was at risk. The ranch was in jeopardy, and Will was asking for help, asking her to act quickly to secure their future. The storm outside had begun to rage, the wind howling louder as the pressure of the moment mounted. Charlotte stood frozen for a moment, the letter clutched tightly in her hands, her mind reeling. She had always believed she could manage her own fate, that she could handle the challenges that came her way. But this was different. This wasn't just about the estate anymore, it was about the ranch, about Will, about something far greater than just their individual survival. She glanced toward the window, her heart racing as she made her decision. She could no longer stand apart from Will, from the man who had become more than just a business partner. The forces working against them were growing stronger, and it was time to face them together. Will's mind raced as he paced the main building, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The storm outside had picked up in intensity, the sky darkening as the wind howled, rattling the windows and the walls. It felt as though everything around him was falling apart, that his world was breaking down in pieces faster than he could pick them up. He couldn't do this alone anymore. He had been fighting for so long, so hard, but he was starting to feel like he was losing. McLean was just the beginning. The financial troubles, the rustlers, and the drought had all converged at once. He couldn't handle it anymore, not without Charlotte. It had always been her steadying presence that kept him grounded. She had become more than just a partner in name, she had become his ally, his equal in this fight. He had relied on her more than he had ever admitted, and now, with the storm bearing down on them, he knew he needed her more than ever. He turned toward the door just as he heard the unmistakable sound of hooves outside, and when the door swung open, there she was. Charlotte, standing in the doorway, her expression determined, her eyes meeting his with an unspoken understanding. "You're not alone in this," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "We'll face this together." And just like that, everything changed. Will didn't have to ask. He didn't have to speak the words that had been circling in his mind. Charlotte was here. She had come. And together, they would face what lay ahead. He walked toward her, feeling the weight of the moment settle between them, the storm outside only amplifying the urgency of their situation. The ranch, their future, was at stake, but with Charlotte at his side, Will knew that there was still hope. There was still a chance to fight back. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice low, but filled with the conviction that had been missing for far too long. Together. And with that, they set their sights on the path ahead, knowing that the storm both outside and within their hearts was far from over, but that together they could weather it. The wind had turned fierce by the time Will saw Charlotte coming toward him across the soaked ground. Her silhouette was barely visible through the sheets of rain, her horse's hooves sinking into the mud as it struggled against the rising storm. The downpour was relentless, washing over everything in its path, a force of nature that seemed as determined as the forces pressing down on them both. Will had ridden out to check on the water source one last time, his coat soaked through, his boots heavy with mud. The cattle were already feeling the strain, their restless movements signaling the tension that had taken hold of everything. It was more than the rain that weighed on Will now, it was the sense of defeat that gnawed at him with every passing day. But then, through the mist of the storm, he saw her. Charlotte's horse moved with purpose, its rider holding on with an air of determination that Will had come to recognize over the past months. She wasn't a woman who backed down, no matter the odds, and in that moment, the sight of her brought a flicker of hope. Even through the downpour, even through the doubt that had clouded his thoughts for so long, Charlotte had come. She dismounted quickly as she reached him, her movements swift and purposeful despite the rain that clung to her form. Her face was set with a determined resolve, her eyes locking with his for just a moment before she pulled her coat tighter against her. "I got your message," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "McLean's men have been spotted near the creek." "We don't have much time." Will's heart pounded, his mind immediately focusing on the crisis at hand. The very water that had kept them alive for so long, that had kept his ranch running, was being threatened. McLean's men had made their move. Will had no illusions about how far they would go to seize control. And he knew that Charlotte's arrival, though a welcome sight, wasn't a luxury. They were in this together now, whether either of them was ready for it or not. "I've already got the men rounding up what they can. We need to get ahead of them, hold the line at the creek," Will said, his words clipped and fast, the rain battering against his face. "I need you to handle the rest. You've got the connections, we need reinforcements." Charlotte nodded, pulling her wet hair out of her face. The wind had picked up again, swirling the rain around them in sharp gusts, but there was something in her eyes now, something different from before. No longer was she the woman who had hesitated, who had stood on the edge of this life, unsure if it was hers to claim. She was here in this moment, standing beside him. "I'll get word to the community," she said, her voice cutting through the wind. "We can't let McLean take this from us, not now, not after everything we've done." There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared purpose that transcended the tension that had once lingered between them. Will nodded, the weight of his responsibility settling firmly on his shoulders again. But this time there was something else. Charlotte was no longer just a partner by necessity. She had become an integral part of this battle, an ally in every sense. Inside the barn, the flickering lantern light cast long shadows across the wooden walls, and the rain continued to pour, creating a drumbeat on the roof above. They were alone for the moment, the air thick with the urgency of their situation. The ranch hands had been gathered, awaiting orders, but it was Will and Charlotte who took the lead, a team united in purpose. Will stood at the center of the barn, the maps and rough sketches of the ranch spread out before him on a large table. His fingers traced the edges of the water source, the winding path that led to the creek, the areas that were vulnerable to attack. The rain outside was deafening, but in the silence of the barn, his mind was laser-focused. "We'll need to fortify the western boundary of the creek," he said, his voice steady as he pointed to a section of the map. "If McLean's men are planning a full assault, they'll try to come in from there." Charlotte nodded, her eyes scanning the map as she processed the information. She wasn't just a bystander in this conversation, she was a vital part of the plan. Will could see the sharpness in her gaze, the way she absorbed details and made connections he hadn't even considered. "Do you have anyone we can count on for reinforcements?" Will asked. "We'll need to move fast." Charlotte paused, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the map, her mind working. "I'll send word to the local councilman," she said with quiet resolve. "They owe me, and I intend to collect. I can get the support we need, but we must move quickly. We can't risk McLean getting control of the water." "Agreed," Will said, feeling the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in a long time, something akin to hope. It wasn't a guarantee, not by any means, but the plan was taking shape. They had a chance now together. The storm outside raged on, but inside the barn, Will and Charlotte were already in motion. They worked side by side, coordinating their plans with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Will focused on the tactics, organizing the ranch hands to defend the water source, to hold the line against McLean's men. Charlotte, for her part, worked the other angle, reaching out to the community, using her connections to rally support, securing reinforcements from nearby ranchers who had once stood apart from her. As the hours passed, the storm showed no sign of abating, but something else had changed. The distance between them had narrowed. Will and Charlotte moved in synchrony, their actions speaking louder than words. They weren't just partners by necessity anymore, they were united in a way that was undeniable. Will watched as Charlotte handed out orders to the ranch hands, her voice steady, her posture confident despite the rain-soaked misery around them. She was a force to be reckoned with, no longer just the woman he had reluctantly partnered with, but a woman who had earned his respect, his trust. And Charlotte saw it too. She saw the man before her no longer just the stubborn rancher who had resisted her help, but someone who was fighting for something far greater than his own pride. She saw the vulnerability in him that he had never allowed anyone to see, and in that moment she knew that they were both fighting for the same thing, not just the ranch, but a future. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the rain had finally begun to subside. Will stood at the edge of the ranch, watching the men gather near the creek. They had managed to fortify the water source. They had held McLean's men off for now. The battle was far from over, but there was a sense of resolve, of shared purpose, that had begun to take root. Charlotte stood beside him, her presence a steadying force. Their eyes met across the land, and for the first time, Will felt something deeper than just survival. They had fought together, and together they would rebuild. The first light of morning broke over the horizon, painting the land in shades of gold and amber. Will stood at the edge of the newly repaired fence, his hands resting on the weathered wood, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself a quiet breath of relief. The pastures stretched before him, the grass thickening with life after weeks of careful tending and the hope of better days ahead. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was a starter sign that they were moving forward. He glanced beside him, and there was Charlotte, her face flushed from the work they had been putting in over the past weeks. Her movements were confident, determined just as they had been when she first arrived, but now there was a softer edge to her demeanor, a sense of pride in their accomplishments. She was no longer just a business partner, she had become an equal in every sense of the word, and Will felt a quiet warmth in his chest at the sight of her. Together, they had rebuilt the foundation of the ranch, brick by brick, post by post. They had poured their sweat and their hearts into the work, and it was beginning to show. The land that had once felt desolate now hummed with life. The new water system they had installed ran steadily through the fields, and the cattle, once thin and ragged, were starting to look stronger, their coats shinier, their steps firmer. Will reached for a piece of the newly reinforced fence, his fingers grazing the rough surface of the wood, and he felt a surge of pride. It wasn't just the ranch that was being rebuilt, it was something deeper, something within himself, within them both. They were no longer fighting alone, they were fighting together. Charlotte moved beside him, adjusting the reins of her horse as she gave him a quick, encouraging smile. The hard work had taken its toll on both of them, long days under the unforgiving sun, dealing with setbacks and obstacles, but there was a shared satisfaction in the way the ranch had begun to take shape again. "Let's finish this stretch," Will said, his voice steady and filled with purpose. "We're close." Charlotte nodded, wiping a strand of wet hair from her forehead, and together they turned back to their work. There was no time to waste. The ranch was still fragile, but every fence post they replaced, every improvement they made, was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. The work was grueling, but the sense of accomplishment grew with each task completed. In the days that followed, Will and Charlotte worked side by side, repairing more of the ranch's infrastructure and reinforcing the fences that ran across the property. Will focused on the water system, testing the new irrigation channels they had laid down, ensuring that the precious resource would flow where it was needed most. Charlotte took charge of the supplies, organizing the materials for repairs and handling the financial aspects of the project. They moved in tandem, their actions almost second nature now. Charlotte handed Will the tools he needed as he fixed the irrigation gates, and Will carefully explained the nuances of the ranch's water flow system as Charlotte oversaw the men repairing the barns. They had learned each other's rhythms, their strengths and weaknesses, and somehow, the work felt lighter when they shared it. It was no longer just about getting through the day, it was about building something together, a future they could both rely on. In one corner of the property, Will and Charlotte oversaw the reconstruction of the stable. The structure had been decaying for months, the roof sagging under the weight of time and neglect. They stripped away the old wood, replacing beams and rafters, reshingling the roof, making it stronger, more secure. Charlotte stood back, inspecting the work as Will finished securing the last of the rafters. Her lips pressed into a satisfied line. "It's coming together," she said, her voice quiet but filled with the same pride she had always carried when they had started this journey together. Will wiped his hands on his trousers, his chest rising and falling with exertion. He wasn't used to relying on someone else for help, but with Charlotte beside him, he had found a strength he hadn't known existed. He nodded, looking out over the ranch, feeling something inside him shift. "It is," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "It's ours." As the weeks passed, the ranch began to transform, but the real test was always going to be the community's response. The ranch had been a symbol of pride for the town, a legacy passed down for generations. Will knew that they couldn't do it alone. They needed the support of the neighbors, the hands who worked the land alongside him. One evening, after a long day of repairs, Charlotte called a town meeting. The small, bustling community had gathered at the local meeting hall, the wooden floors creaking under the weight of those who had come to hear what she had to say. Charlotte stood at the front, a calm yet determined presence in the room, her hands resting on the lectern as the murmurs died down. "I've called this meeting to discuss the future of the ranch," she began, her voice clear and steady. "We've made great strides, but there is still much to be done. We need your support to keep this land alive, to ensure that Will's family legacy and the town's estates slip away." The room was filled with a mix of familiar faces, some hopeful, some skeptical. But Charlotte wasn't here to beg for charity, she was here to show them what they could accomplish together. "I know many of you have heard the rumors about the ranch," she continued, her eyes scanning the crowd, "about McLean's push into our territory. But we've come together before. We can do it again. We can't let him take what's ours." A few heads nodded in agreement, and Will felt a surge of gratitude. The community had been through hard times, just like him. But now there was something new in the air, something that spoke of hope, of unity. "I've spoken with some of the neighboring ranchers," Charlotte said, "and they are willing to lend their support. We need to reinforce the creek. We need the manpower, and we need the resources. Will and I have already begun the work, but we can't do it alone. This is about all of us, our future." The room grew quiet as people exchanged glances, and then, slowly, hands began to rise. The town was on the verge of something. People were willing to put their faith in Charlotte, in Will, and in what they were building. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving together. The skepticism, the doubt, that had hung over the ranch for so long began to fade as the sense of solidarity grew stronger. By the end of the meeting, promises had been made, pledges of supplies, of labor, and most importantly, of belief. It wasn't just Will's battle anymore. It was everyone's. As the townspeople filed out of the meeting hall, Charlotte turned to Will, a quiet smile on her lips. "We've got them," she said softly. "We're not alone anymore." Will stood next to her, the weight of the last few months lifting just slightly from his shoulders. The storm had passed, and now the future stretched out before them, a future they were building, hand in hand, with the support of the community around them. Together they had risen from the ashes stronger, more united, and ready to face whatever came next. The long hours of hard work had taken their toll, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the bustle of the day began to quiet. Will and Charlotte found themselves at the edge of the ranch house, standing in the cool shade of the porch, the warmth of the evening air wrapping around them like a soft blanket. Will had just finished securing the last of the cattle for the night. The day had been filled with the usual routine, mending fences, checking the irrigation systems, organizing plans for the next steps in their ongoing battle against McLean. Yet now, in the soft, fading light of day, the weight of the world seemed to momentarily lift. He leaned against the porch railing, his arms crossed, and watched as Charlotte approached. She had changed into a simple blouse and skirt, the fabric soft against her skin after a long day of labor. She looked tired, but her eyes sparkled with something more, something that mirrored the quiet satisfaction he felt. But it was something deeper, something unspoken. "I've been meaning to show you something," Will said, his voice softer than usual, as he pushed away from the railing. Charlotte tilted her head, the light from the setting sun catching the strands of her hair that had escaped her braid. "Something about the ranch?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Something you might not have noticed yet. Follow me." They moved together, walking down the familiar path toward the back of the property, where the land stretched out toward the distant hills. Will's boots kicked up the soft earth as they walked side by side, their steps in sync, though the distance between them had always been closer than Charlotte had ever expected. They reached a small rise in the land, a quiet, peaceful corner that seemed untouched by the turmoil of the past months. It was a grove of trees that had been there longer than Will could remember, tall pines that lined the edge of the creek, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The water babbled softly nearby, and the air here felt different, cooler, calmer, as if the land itself had drawn a breath. "I used to come here when I was a boy," Will said, his voice low and filled with the weight of memories. "Whenever things got hard, whenever I felt like the world was too much, I'd come here. It's where I go to think, and to remember that not everything in life is a battle." Charlotte stood beside him, her gaze sweeping over the tranquil spot. She could sense that this place was important to him, that it held pieces of his past and his heart. Slowly she turned to face him, her hand brushing against the rough bark of the tree they stood near. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft. "I can see why you would come here." There was a moment of silence as Will looked at her, his eyes deep with unspoken emotion. Charlotte's heart fluttered, and she wasn't sure why. The air between them had shifted, but she couldn't quite place why or how. For a moment it felt as if the world outside this small, sacred space didn't matter. No creditors, no rival ranchers, no storm that had just passed. There was only the two of them, the land beneath their feet, and the quiet understanding that was beginning to grow. Later that evening, after a simple meal shared in the warmth of the ranch house, Will and Charlotte decided to take a ride under the stars. The air had cooled, and the sky above them was clear, the stars shining brightly as the moon rose slowly in the east. The soft, rhythmic sound of hooves against the earth was the only sound that accompanied them as they rode side by side across the wide open fields. Will, on his horse, glanced over at Charlotte as she sat tall and graceful in the saddle. Her hair, now loose and wet from the day's work, swayed gently in the breeze. And there was something in her profile that struck him deeply: her strength, her resilience, the way she seemed to carry the world without faltering. She had come to the ranch as an outsider, someone determined to help, but in these quiet moments, he began to see her differently. She was no longer just the woman who helped him rebuild. It was more than that. She was becoming someone he couldn't imagine his life without. The sound of the horses' hooves seemed to synchronize as they rode together in companionable silence. Will could feel the pull of her presence, and the closeness between them was undeniable. Every time their eyes met, every time they exchanged a glance, something flickered: a shared understanding, a bond that had begun to grow stronger with each passing day. "You've changed this place," Will said after a long silence, his voice carrying the weight of his sincerity. "I don't think I realized just how much until now. I didn't expect you to stay, to keep fighting. But you have." Charlotte looked at him, a soft smile on her lips, though there was a trace of vulnerability in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. "You've changed it too," she replied, her voice steady but filled with an emotion that mirrored his. "We've both had to let go of what we thought we knew. This place, this ranch, hasn't just been rebuilt with wood and nails. It's been rebuilt with something else, something we didn't know we had to give." Will's heart stuttered in his chest as he listened to her words, feeling the weight of them settle between them. She was right. They had rebuilt the ranch, but it was the bond they had formed in the process that was the true foundation of what they were building together. The horses slowed to a walk, and Will guided his mount toward a small hill at the edge of the pasture. He stopped at the crest, and Charlotte halted beside him, her gaze sweeping out over the land that stretched before them. The fields were quiet now, the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. The stars twinkled above them, as if watching over the land they had fought to protect. "I've never known anything like this," Charlotte said softly, her words filled with awe as she looked out over the land. The sense of peace, of purpose. Will felt the stirrings of something deep within him. It was more than just a quiet admiration he felt for her, it was something stronger. Something he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge before now. "We're building something here, Charlotte," he said, his voice low but thick with emotion. "Something that won't fall apart. Something worth fighting for." She turned to face him then, and the distance between them seemed to close, the world narrowing to just the two of them. There were no words left to speak, only the silent understanding that had been growing between them, the recognition that they were no longer just two people trying to survive. They had become something more, partners in this life they were creating, and maybe, just maybe, something deeper was beginning to take root. Will reached out, his hand brushing against hers, the touch gentle, but it carried the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. Charlotte's fingers curled around his, and in that simple act, something shifted. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures, just the quiet certainty that they were in this together. Their bond, their love, had been built on the foundation of their shared struggles, and now it was beginning to bloom. As the moonlight bathed them in its soft glow, Will and Charlotte sat side by side, their hearts beating in tandem, knowing that what they had found in each other was something worth protecting, something worth cherishing for the rest of their lives. Chapter 5: A New Horizon. The day began early, the sun's rays casting a soft glow over the ranch as Will and Charlotte prepared for the celebration. The hard work of the past months had finally borne fruit, and now it was time to share that triumph with the community. At the ranch, the air was filled with a flurry of activity as the ranch hands put finishing touches on the decorations. Colorful banners flapped in the wind, strung between the trees and the barn, while long tables were being arranged with careful precision, draped in white cloths and adorned with wildflowers. The scent of roasting meat and fresh-baked bread hung in the air, mingling with the unmistakable sound of music drifting from the makeshift bandstand near the barn. It was a rare day of joy, a day of celebration, of healing, of community. Will stood near the front of the barn, surveying the preparations with a quiet sense of satisfaction. His eyes swept across the work that had gone into making this day a reality: the new fences, the rebuilt barn, the stable that now stood strong and proud. But it wasn't just the tangible work that filled him with pride, it was the feeling of unity that had taken root here, a unity forged from months of struggle and triumph, of shared dreams and determination. Charlotte joined him, her presence a welcome and steadying force. She had changed into a simple yet elegant dress, the deep blue fabric a reflection of the calm confidence she had exuded over the past few months. There was a certain glow about her now, not just from the hard work they had shared, but from something deeper, something that had grown between them. Her eyes sparkled with excitement as she stepped beside him, surveying the festivities. "You did this," she said softly, her voice filled with awe as she took in the bustling preparations. "We did this." Will glanced at her, his gaze warm but thoughtful. "We did," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. He had never expected this day to come, the day when their hard work would be recognized, when they could stand side by side and know that they had built something together, not just for themselves but for everyone who had supported them. As the afternoon sun reached its peak, the event began in earnest. People from all walks of life, ranchers, townsfolk, and high society acquaintances, alike gathered in the town square, their faces lit with smiles and laughter. The music swelled, filling the air with an energy that was contagious, and the sound of boots tapping on the dusty ground mixed with the rattle of dishes and glasses as the long tables filled with food and drink. Will and Charlotte moved through the crowd, greeting friends and neighbors, exchanging pleasantries with those who had helped them, and offering thanks to those who had come to support the celebration. There was a sense of unity, a feeling that the town had turned a corner. The rifts that had once divided them between the working class and the wealthier citizens, between Will and the people who had once doubted him, had begun to heal. The celebration wasn't just a party, it was a symbol of what could be achieved when people came together, when they put aside their differences and worked for a common cause. Charlotte stood beside Will as they welcomed the guests, her smile bright and warm. She looked out over the crowd and felt a sense of pride swell in her chest. It was clear now, clearer than ever, that this ranch, this community, was her home. She had fought for it, and now she stood beside Will, her partner, her equal, knowing that together they had created something lasting. As the evening wore on, the music shifted from lively tunes to slower, more reflective melodies, and the atmosphere softened. The townspeople began to gather around a newly erected structure near the edge of the ranch, a small community hall that had been built with the combined efforts of Will, Charlotte, and the townspeople. It was a modest building, but it stood as a symbol of what they had achieved together. Will and Charlotte made their way to the front, standing side by side as the mayor stepped forward to offer a speech. "This new building represents more than just brick and mortar," the mayor said, his voice resonating through the crowd. "It represents the unity we've found in the face of adversity. It stands as a testament to the strength of this community, our ability to come together, to support each other, and to rise from the ashes of hardship. The crowd erupted in applause, and Charlotte felt a lump form in her throat as she glanced at Will. He reached for her hand, his grip warm and solid, and she squeezed it, feeling the bond they had created in that simple gesture. "Here's to the future," the mayor continued, raising his glass in a gesture of celebration. "Here's to Will Parker and Charlotte Montgomery, who have shown us all what it means to fight for something bigger than ourselves." Another round of applause erupted, and Will smiled, though his gaze remained focused on Charlotte. She had been the spark, the one who had first believed in what they could do, and together they had made it happen. She had become more than just the woman who helped him rebuild the ranch. She had become his equal, his partner in every sense of the word. As the celebration continued, Will and Charlotte stepped away from the crowd for a moment of solitude. They walked toward the edge of the ranch, near the newly repaired barn, where a small crowd had gathered to witness the unveiling of the restored landmark, the large wooden sign that had once marked the entrance to the Parker Ranch, now freshly painted and polished. It stood proudly against the backdrop of the barn, a symbol of both their personal triumphs and the renewed spirit of the community. "This is it, Charlotte," Will said softly, his voice thick with emotion as he gazed at the sign. "This is our future. Together." Charlotte turned to him, her gaze soft, yet filled with a quiet strength that matched his. She placed her hand on his arm, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "Together," she agreed, her voice steady and sure. "We've built something that will last." They stood there for a moment, the sounds of the celebration continuing behind them, the laughter and music, a reminder of what they had accomplished. It wasn't just the ranch they had rebuilt, it was their lives, their futures, and the future of everyone who had come together to make it happen. As they stood in the soft glow of the setting sun, Will and Charlotte knew that this was only the beginning. The storm had passed, and they had emerged stronger for it. Together they had created something enduring, a home, a future, and a love that had blossomed through shared struggles and triumphs. The horizon stretched before them, filled with possibilities, and Will knew with certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. The lively sounds of the celebration slowly began to fade as the last of the evening guests departed, their laughter and chatter echoing through the cooling air. The bonfire that had burned brightly in the center of the gathering sputtered and died, leaving only the faint scent of smoke to linger in the breeze. The moonlight stretched over the ranch, casting long shadows across the land that had witnessed their struggle and triumph. Will and Charlotte stood near the edge of the festivities, their hands brushing as they made their way toward a quiet hill that overlooked the expanse of the ranch. The noise of the celebration had faded, replaced by the soothing sounds of the night, the rustle of the trees, the distant lowing of cattle, and the soft, rhythmic thud of their boots against the earth. The ranch, bathed in the silver glow of the moon, looked different now, more alive, more full of promise. They reached the top of the hill, where a solitary tree stood, its twisted branches a silent witness to the years of history that had unfolded on this land. Will leaned against the trunk, his gaze stretching out toward the ranch house in the distance, the light still flickering from within. It was peaceful here, away from the crowds, away from the expectations. For the first time in a long while, Will allowed himself to simply breathe, to enjoy the stillness that surrounded them. Charlotte stood beside him, her eyes drawn to the horizon, where the land seemed to stretch on forever. Her expression was soft, contemplative. After everything they had been through, after the battles and the struggles, they had come so far. It was hard to believe that they had reached this point, the point where they could finally look forward, rather than constantly fight to survive. "You've always loved this view, haven't you?" Charlotte asked softly, her voice breaking the silence. Will nodded, his eyes still on the land below. "I came here a lot as a kid," he said, his tone distant, reflective. "When things got hard, I'd come out here and just look. It gave me space to think, to clear my mind." Charlotte looked at him, studying his face in the moonlight. "And now?" she asked, her voice gentle. "What do you think?" He turned to her, the warmth of the evening, the glow of their shared moment, slowly easing away the weight that had settled on his shoulders for so long. "I think I've found a new reason to look," he said, his voice low, a hint of emotion threading through his words. "A reason to see a future." Charlotte's heart fluttered in her chest as she met his gaze. There was something in his eyes, something that went beyond the pride they had in the ranch, something deeper. It was as though the land itself had given them both a new sense of purpose, a new hope. Will took a step closer to Charlotte, the moonlight casting soft shadows on his face. He could feel the weight of everything they had been through, the struggles, the doubts, the fears, but now, standing here with her, it all seemed distant. The past was behind them. There was only the future, only the promise of what they could build together. "We've made it through the worst of it," he said, his voice thick with the emotion of the moment. "But it's just the beginning," Charlotte nodded, her eyes searching his. "I know," she said softly. "We've rebuilt the ranch. But we're not finished yet. There's still so much to do. So much we can do." Will reached out, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, his touch lingering a moment longer than necessary. The warmth between them, the connection they had forged through their shared struggles, had grown stronger with every passing day. Will continued, his voice steady with conviction. "We'll make the land stronger. We'll bring in more cattle. We'll invest in better irrigation. There's a lot of work left to do, but we'll do it. Together." Charlotte's heart quickened as she listened to his words. There was a fire in his voice, a drive that mirrored her own. She had come to the ranch to help him, to help them, but what she hadn't realized until now was how much she had come to care about it, about this place, about what they were building together. "What about the community?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. "The town's changed, Will. We've rebuilt more than just the ranch. We've shown the people here that we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for them too." Will smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep within him. "We'll keep building those ties," he said, his hand resting on her arm in a gesture of quiet confidence. "This place, this land, it belongs to everyone. Not just me, not just you. We'll make sure they know that. We'll keep working together, bringing in new businesses, new families. The town's future is just as important as ours." Charlotte's heart swelled at the way he spoke, at the depth of his belief in what they were doing. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about thriving. It was about creating a future that would benefit everyone, not just themselves. "And after that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though daring to ask the question that had been lingering in her heart. "What comes next?" Will paused, his gaze softening as he looked at her. There was something in the way he looked at her, something that made her heart skip a beat. He stepped closer, his hand resting on her shoulder as he gently pulled her to him. The distance between them had closed in a way that felt natural, inevitable. "We'll build a family," he said, his words slow and deliberate, as though they were a promise. "We'll raise children here, children who'll grow up with this land, with this town. And when we're old, they'll be the ones to carry on what we've started." Charlotte's breath caught in her chest. The words hung in the air between them, a quiet promise that she hadn't dared to hope for. A family. A future. Together. She looked up at him, her voice soft but sure. "I want that," she whispered, her hands resting gently on his chest. "I want a family with you, Will." Will's gaze softened, and his fingers brushed against her cheek, a tender gesture that held more weight than any declaration could. He didn't need to say anything more. He had already said it all with the look in his eyes, the shared understanding, the silent promise of a future that was no longer just a dream. Together they would build something that would last, a legacy of love, strength, and resilience. And in that moment, under the quiet night sky, they both knew that their future was waiting, just beyond the horizon. The land stretched before them, lush and vibrant, a vivid contrast to the dust and despair that had once defined this place. The once barren fields now hummed with life, the crops thick and green, the herds grazing peacefully in the distance. The barn stood tall and solid, its newly restored walls gleaming in the morning light. It was a testament to everything they had endured, everything they had fought for. Will and Charlotte walked side by side along the familiar path, their boots soft against the earth that had once been so unforgiving. The pastures stretched out before them, the cattle content and strong, the fence lines sturdy and well-maintained. Every corner of the ranch had been transformed, and with each step, they could see the tangible proof of their hard-won success. Will's hand brushed against the familiar wooden fence, the posts now reinforced and straight, the wire taut and secure. He ran his fingers along the metal, remembering the countless hours spent repairing and rebuilding, each task more daunting than the last. Yet here they were, standing in the very space that had once felt like an insurmountable challenge, now thriving with new life. "Look at this," Charlotte said softly, her voice filled with quiet pride. She stopped for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the fields, taking in the beauty of the land they had both poured so much into. "We've come so far." Will nodded, his gaze also sweeping across the ranch. "We have," he agreed. "It wasn't easy, but it was worth it." They continued walking, passing by the flourishing crops that now covered what had once been barren soil. The corn was tall and strong, the wheat waving gently in the breeze. The once empty fields had been transformed into an abundant harvest, and the smell of fresh earth filled the air. It was the kind of success that couldn't be bought, it was earned, one grueling step at a time. As they walked, their minds drifted back to the days when things seemed impossible. The drought, the rustlers, the constant struggle to keep the ranch afloat. There were moments when they had both doubted whether they would ever make it out of the darkness, moments when the weight of the world had seemed too much to bear. Yet here they were, standing together, having made it through the hardest of battles. They had fought side by side, and now the fruits of their labor were everywhere. Charlotte glanced at Will, a soft smile playing at the corners of her lips. "We've done it, Will," she said quietly. "We've turned this place around." Will smiled in return, but there was something deeper in his expression, something that spoke of quiet reflection. "We did it together," he said, his voice steady but filled with meaning. "Without you, none of this would have been possible." They stopped for a moment at the edge of the creek, the water running clear and steady once more, a symbol of their victory over the forces that had once threatened to tear them apart. Will reached down to touch the cool water, his fingers grazing the surface, watching the ripples spread out from where his hand disturbed the flow. It had taken so much to get to this point, and yet, in this quiet moment, he knew it had all been worth it. After a moment of shared silence, Charlotte spoke again, her voice soft but filled with determination. "It's time to mark this moment, to make it official." Will turned to her, a questioning look in his eyes. "What do you mean?" She smiled and gestured toward a small area near the edge of the creek, where a new sapling had been carefully planted. It stood tall and strong, its leaves just beginning to bud. The tree had been chosen carefully, a symbol of the future they had built together. "I thought we should plant something," Charlotte said. "A tree. Something that will grow with us, something that will stand as a reminder of what we've achieved and the future we've created." Will's eyes softened as he looked at the tree, his chest swelling with a quiet sense of pride. "I like that idea," he said, his voice thick with emotion. They stood together as Charlotte knelt beside the young tree, gently breaking the earth around its roots. Will joined her, his hands moving to help as they carefully tended to the small sapling. It was a simple gesture, but it was symbolic, a commitment to the future, a recognition of the foundation they had laid, and a promise to see it grow strong. As they finished planting the tree, Charlotte looked up at Will, her eyes shining with quiet affection. "This will be a part of us," she said softly. "A legacy that will endure." Will reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "It will be," he agreed. "A legacy of strength, of what we've built together." They stood together, looking down at the tree, a quiet sense of fulfillment washing over them. It wasn't just the tree they had planted, it was their future, their dreams and their love. This was the beginning of something lasting, something that would carry their story for generations to come. Later that evening, after the last of the guests had departed and the ranch settled into its familiar quiet, Will and Charlotte found themselves sitting on the porch. The stars above shone brightly in the clear night sky, the cool breeze carrying the sense of the land they had worked so hard to restore. Charlotte sat with her back against the wooden rail, her eyes gazing out toward the horizon, where the last traces of the setting sun were fading into the night. Will sat beside her, his hand resting on the rail, his gaze following hers as they both took in the view the land that stretched out before them, the land they had fought for, and the future they had built. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Charlotte asked softly, her voice a quiet reflection of the journey they had shared. Will turned to look at her, his eyes filled with affection. "Every day," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's hard to believe sometimes. But then I look around, and I see all that we've accomplished, and I know it was worth every step." Charlotte smiled, her hand moving to rest on his. "I used to wonder if I was doing the right thing, if I was making the right choices. But now I can see it. I can see that everything we've done, everything we've been through, has led us here. To this." Will nodded, his fingers intertwining with hers. "We've built something, Charlotte. Not just the ranch, but something much bigger, a future, a family." Charlotte's heart swelled as she looked at him. "A family," she repeated, the words sweet on her lips. The quiet of the night wrapped around them, the world at peace for a moment. The road ahead was still uncertain, but they knew one thing for sure: whatever came their way, they would face it together. They sat there for a long while, the stars overhead a reminder of the endless possibilities that lay before them. The horizon stretched out before them, filled with hope and promise. The legacy they had built was just beginning, and as they gazed toward the future, they knew that their love, their resilience, and their determination would carry them forward into a life that was theirs to shape together. And in that moment, Will and Charlotte knew that the legacy they had created would endure not just for them, but for those who would follow in their footsteps. A lasting legacy of love, of family, and of the unbreakable bond that had been forged through hardship, triumph, and the promise of a bright future.